Greetings all, I'm Rick Levine, and we're here today for the astrology forecast for the month of June 2020. And sometimes I feel like a broken record saying, boy, what a month it's going to be, but boy, what a month it's going to be. Before we jump into the material, I do have a couple of quick announcements. First of all, I would like to mention that I will be doing a weekend workshop for Astrology Toronto. This is the astrology group in Toronto. It was going to be held in Toronto, but because of COVID-19, this is going to be on Zoom. It's going to be an online virtual workshop. And so wherever you are on the planet, you're able to attend this. And information is available at Astrology Toronto. That's one word, astrologytoronto.com. You can go to astrologytoronto.com/Rick-Levine, and that'll get you to the page with the information about this weekend retreat / workshop. This is going to be the basic teachings of Rick Levine. On Friday night, we're going to be delving into the issues of reincarnation and disincarnation and past lives and what's that all about really and how does it work. On Saturday, we're going to be doing chart reading material. We're going to be looking at how to improve chart readings, whether you're a beginner, intermediate, or professional. Doesn't really matter as long as you have an idea of the planets and signs. You won't get lost too quickly. But Saturday, we'll be rolling up our sleeves and looking at how to do chart readings and how to reframe astrology in modern times. And on Sunday, we'll be delving into relationship astrology and doing an overall synthesis, including looking at some charts of some of the participants. That is June 5th through the 7th. And the link or the address, the URL is down below here somewhere. Second thing I want to announce is, this is a reminder that my daily blog, my daily Planet Pulse is now available on Instagram, and you can follow me on Instagram at Rick Levine Astrologer, Rick Levine Astrologer, and read my little daily blurbs about what the heck's going on up there, out there. It's not sign by sign. It's just the cosmic weather. It's the overall outlook or view of what's happening up there in the sky. Third and last, I would just like also to let everyone know that I am now doing a weekly online video live with Astrology Hub. And this is called The Cosmic Connection. We're recording these weekly on Thursday afternoons at 4 p.m. Pacific time. You'll need to adjust your time zones accordingly. And these will be available on Facebook Live and on YouTube. And so keep an eye out for that. You can go to Astrology Hub either on Facebook or astrologyhub.com and find out more information on that. And just one last quick thing, and that is a shout out and a thank you to all the subscribers and Patreon members who are part of my Patreon support subscriber team. There are many levels for those of you who are not familiar with Patreon. Check it out. The more support I have, the more work I'll be able to do, because this is what funds the effort and the equipment and so on that goes into creating these videos. So thank you to all my Patreon supporters, and you can find out more about that at patreon.com/Rick Levine. Okay, so now jumping into this month, and like I said at the beginning, quite a month it is. We are already in the midst of retrograde season, and the retrograde season actually picks up another notch during June as Mercury turns retrograde, adding that to the mix. and that Mercury retrograde occurs, let's get my notes out here, Mercury retrograde occurs on June 17th. And what's interesting is that just the following week, on June 24th, Venus, which has been retrograde, turns direct, except Neptune turns retrograde just a couple of days prior on the 22nd. So we have some planetary shifting going on. Saturn has already been retrograde the longest. Jupiter and Pluto turned retrograde. Venus turned retrograde back in May. And now in June, Mercury will turn retrograde, and so will Neptune, but Venus turns direct. And of course, all of this is getting us ready for the last hit on this retrograde season, which will be later in the year when Mars turns retrograde. And although this is a ways off, mentioning it now is important, because one of the big events of June is that Mars, which is now moving through Pisces, actually enters Aries on June 27th, which will be a major energetic shift. Now, normally Mars spends about 6-7 weeks in each sign, about 7 weeks usually in each sign. However, because of Mars's strange retrograde pattern, Mars whizzes through 11 signs of the zodiac, and then when it turns retrograde, it basically hangs out in the same space for roughly a half a year or even slightly longer. And so what that means is that Mars, which moves into Aries, which is its home sign, so we're going to get a real powerful blast from Mars when it moves into Aries on June 27th. Normally, it would be in Aries from June 27th through August, through the middle end of August. But what happens is that Mars slows down, and by September 9th, Mars at the very end of Aries turns retrograde. It retrogrades all the way back through Aries, turns direct mid-November, and doesn't leave Aries until January 7th, 2021. So we have 6 months, actually 5 months, 5.5 months of Mars in Aries. And like I said, I'm foreshadowing, I'm mentioning that because that is part of what this month, the end of this month is about. But bringing us back to to June as a whole, not only do we have this retrograde shuffle, but we also have 2 eclipses. And this, normally eclipses come in pairs twice a year. So normally there's 4 eclipses a year. Occasionally eclipses will come in a trio rather than in a duo. We actually have 3 eclipses. We have them on June 5th, June 20th, and then we'll have one on July 5th. And so we are sandwiched in this incredible changing dynamic period of time. And the eclipse that is on June 20th actually occurs on the same day as the summer solstice in the Northern Hemisphere. And so this is an incredibly dynamic and powerful eclipse, and we will get to that in just a moment. But I wanted to paint the picture that as we're moving into the month of June, and where many of us are getting antsy, we're crawling walls. We want this strange episode of the COVID-19 pandemic to be over. We want this epidemic of fear to be resolved. We want the uncertainty of the economic and political future, especially in the United States, but I know around the world. We want this to be resolved. Well, unfortunately, it ain't going away yet. And I think that's the important thing about this, about the astrology of June, is that with this huge retrograde swirl of Venus plus the outer planets of Jupiter, Saturn, and Pluto, the energy is, I wouldn't say it's stuck, but we're not ready to move forward yet because we're in this remedial kind of making up review class for what we haven't gotten right. And we're not going to just be able to take a quick test and be done with the course. We actually have to sit through the class hours. We have to go back through it. And that's a lot of what this summer is about. So I don't think we're going to see a huge amount of forward movement very quickly. Or if we do, we're going to see forward movement, and then we're going to realize that we have to go back yet and take it slower as we move out of this strange phase that we are in. Another piece of this phase it also plays with us. Really, it's with us all through May, June, and even into July. And that is with the Venus retrograde. And in last month's report about May, the forecast for May, we talked about how Venus made a square with Neptune, which was basically set us up to be uncertain about what we want. It set us up to be confused, Neptune, by where we're going, by our fantasies, by our dreams. And when Venus turned retrograde, by the end of May, Venus had actually made that connection, that square with Neptune for a second time. And now as Venus turns direct toward the end of the month on June 24th, it won't be until July when Venus moves forward enough that it will make the third and final square with Neptune. And so the point here is that even though we don't have a direct hit of that aspect during the month of June, it's still out there. We're not done. We're not done with this whole Neptune thing. In fact, one of the important pieces of June is that Mars moving through Pisces now, Mars moving through Pisces on June 13th actually catches up and connects with, makes a conjunction with Neptune. And so again, we're in this Neptunian swirl where truth, boundaries, reality is just simply going to continue to be elusive. All right, let's get a chart up and let's run through the month and see where we go. Okay, so we are looking at a chart for June 1st, 2020. And as always, I am using an Aries rising chart because that is good for anywhere on the planet. These charts are mostly going to be for noon and their Pacific Daylight Time. The charts are Pacific Daylight Time, as is the times that I will actually give to you. The aspects that are drawn in the center of the circle, just a quick review. The red means that they are either square or in opposition. The blue lines are trines and sextiles. The green lines are quincunxes. And the orange lines are half squares and square and a halves, semi-squares and sesqui-squares. The other thing to keep in mind is that I have solar fire set so that when the aspect gets very close to exact, when the orbs become very small, the aspect lines get very fat. So don't be confused by some of the thin lines. They're still aspects. They're just not as closely, they're not as tightly orbed. And it's just a quick and easy way to see what the most important thing is when we're doing this kind of work. One last comment is that I do not have aspects drawn into the moon because they just get too noisy, and the moon aspects, the moon changes too quickly. So in this overview for the month, we don't look at the moon aspects. I will draw them back in when we get to talk about the full moon in just a few minutes, so we can see that a little bit more clearly. Where I want to start, though, is that the beginning of June starts off with kind of a false sense of hope and optimism. And that doesn't mean that things can't be okay. But what it does mean is that the sun at 11 degrees of Gemini is making a square and a half. That's a 135-degree angle. It works a lot like a square. It's an aspect of creative tension. It's an aspect of dynamic interaction, and it craves creativity in order to resolve the stress. Now, the sun had just a couple of days ago formed a sesqui-square, that's a square and a half, with Pluto that maybe brought out some real deep power struggles, whether they be political, global, or even personal. But now on the first of the month, the sun is making that same sesqui-square to Jupiter, which is maybe giving us too much hope, maybe making things look too good. If we get some good news, I'm not saying that the good news can't be good news. I'm just saying that we need to pay attention so that we don't overinflate good news and think that that is going to be it, because as the sun moves on day by day, by the time we get to June 6th, which we will in just a second, the sun will have moved along and will be forming that same square and a half, not to optimistic, hopeful, expansive Jupiter, but to contractive, lesson bringer, taskmaster Saturn. So we're going to get the other shoe to fall as the sun moves through those sesqui-squares or sesqui-quadrats. The other piece that we have going on is something that I remember mentioning probably 3 or 4 months ago, and that was the relationship, the dance between the square of Venus to Mars, because Venus and Mars traveled very close to being square for most of April, but the square was never quite reached. And then Venus began to turn retrograde. And now Venus, because Mars is moving faster than Venus, what happens on June 2nd, and I'm going to move this ahead a day, on June 2nd, we actually have Mars forming that square to Venus. And here it's within just minutes of arc, but you'll see the Mars actually will catch up to 14 degrees if we do this. There it is tomorrow, and Venus back to 13. So the two of those cross on the 2nd, and that Venus-Mars square in the mix of everything else can be lovely, but it also can be a problem. And here's what happens with Venus and Mars. You know, Venus is what we like, it's what we crave. Venus is beauty, it's love. Venus is our values, it's what's important to us and what we like, whether it's mentally or physically, sensually. Mars is how we get it. Mars is the directionality that intent it creates to move toward a specific goal. Mars is either how we push into new territory, how we assert ourselves, or how we defend what we think we already have. And so when Venus and Mars connect up, there's sparks, there's actions. There's action. Remember, mythologically, Venus was Mars's consort. So Venus and Mars are the cosmic lovers. And so what happens is that we can think of a square between Venus and Mars. We can think of it as a lover's spat, but then there's makeup sex. And the thing is that with Venus and Mars squares, the energy can be a little bit, I wouldn't say explosive, but it can be sparky, it can be feisty, it can be playful, but the play can also turn serious. And so there can be real dynamic stress between the two components here, between the yin and the yang, between the what we want and how we get it. And in some ways, that stress can lead to unnecessary ego skirmishes. Things can blow up. I mean, it can be a pain in the neck. On the other hand, it can be fuel for amazing creativity and for wonderful love, because without any opposition, and I don't mean an astrological opposition, but without the engaging of energy, there's no progression. And so in a way, when Venus and Mars square, that sets the stage for dynamic interaction that can resolve in a very powerfully, wonderfully, lovingly, magical way. And so we need to be careful about making judgments as to, as to what's going to work and what's not going to work there, as that Venus squares Mars. But the other thing that's happening here also is that the sun is moving into squaring Mars. Remember, Venus is retrograding. Venus is moving backwards, squaring Mars that way, but the sun is moving forward. It's moving faster than Mars, and it's moving into the square the other way. And the sun actually reaches the exact square to Mars on June 6th, and we will get there in just a moment too. The other piece that's happening here is that as Venus is retrograding into that square to Mars, and the sun is moving direct, because it always moves direct, into the square to Mars, Venus and the sun are in conjunction. They are conjunct one another. And remember, when an inner retrograde planet, inner meaning Mercury or Venus, when an inner retrograde planet conjuncts the sun, it's always going to come between the Earth and the sun. And so this is an alignment of beauty and love and what we value and nice things and pleasure and our will. Except because it's inside the sun, this can be something that's so strong that we end up internalizing and then projecting. Rather than seeing things for what they are out there, there is an aspect here of projection that occurs during the retrogrades. But this certainly is a very powerful few days when it comes to create anything creative. I mean, this is a time to apply your creative energy and to burn off what could be a difficult square, because the sun square Mars is often, remember, Mars is also anger. And so if we have unexpressed hostility, resentment, anger actually unexpressed can turn into resentment, gets cold. But when the sun squares Mars on June 6th, let me squeak this ahead a day at a time. And I do want to come back and say something about the nodes here in a moment. But here we are on June 6th. And now we have the sun and Mars making the exact square on June 6th. And it's almost like when Venus was in the mix, there could be pleasure involved. When Venus kind of backs up enough out of the way, we're left with, I think, some potential for overexpression of either anger or defense or offense. Now being defensive and offensive both have their place. There's a time when we need to protect what we have, and there's a time for moving or exploring or pushing into new territory and kind of staking out our own game, if you will, our own territory. However, when Mars squares the sun or the sun squares Mars, we can find ourselves in situations where we're fighting for no apparent reason, or we get sucked into an ego skirmish, if you will, that gets blown out of proportion. Watch what goes on politically here. Obviously, we're in a time of crazy politics where there is not much cooperation between opposing ideas these days. But I would expect that as this Venus and Mars square fades into the Sun-Mars square, that we could see some real political action, some fiery, feisty words or actions. And the thing about the Sun square Mars is that we just want to pay attention in our personal lives. Since we don't have control of the global or political, we want to pay attention that we don't do anything that we'll regret in an hour, a day, or a week, because things can turn into more than we intend them. And so it's really important. And I'm not suggesting here that we just bury our feelings, because buried anger, like I said earlier, turns to resentment. And so it's not just about burying the energy. It's really about finding ways to express it. And I should say, it's not just finding ways to express it, it's finding healthy ways to express it. It's how do we express our need for clarity, our need to defend a position or to set something straight. How do we do that in a way that is kind? How do we do it with compassion rather than doing it with misplaced hate or anger or lack of finesse? That Mars is in Pisces. We can be the compassionate warrior, not just the warrior who takes on the opponent just for the thrill of the victory. So we need to be careful about that. Now, I said I would come back to the nodes because the nodes, many astrologers have been talking about the nodes shifting from Capricorn South Node into Sagittarius South Node, and the North Node from Cancer into Gemini. Remember, the nodes move backwards and spend about 1.5 years in each sign. And I know I mentioned this briefly last month, but I'm mentioning it again because there are two ways to track the movement of the nodes. There's the true node and the mean node. And of course, here we don't mean the mean as in nasty. We mean the average distance that it travels, because it turns out that the nodes which actually move retrograde don't move evenly. They move like wobbly, like this. But their retrograde direct motion isn't like many planets over the course of a year. The retrogrades of the nodes can occur over the course of a week. And so many astrologers use the true node because that's what computers give us the ability to use. However, sometimes there is the possibility that we actually have more detail, more specificity than is actually meaningful. And many astrologers do track the mean node. And although the true nodes changed signs a month ago on June 4th, I think it was, I'm sorry, on May 4th, or right in there, May 4th or 5th, the mean node actually changes signs on June 4th. And so I'm just mentioning that because depending on which nodes you use, it may not agree with what I said last month or this month. But for many people, the nodes have already changed signs. And for some people, well, they're just changing signs now. I think either way, the thing to keep in mind is that the shift from the material Capricorn security Cancer axis into an informational axis that has to do with ideas and opinions and communicating, that this is going to be the underlying theme of the nodes for the next 1.5 years. Now, we want to pay attention to the moon because because as the moon moves into let's back this up a little bit, go back here to June 4th. The moon moves into Sagittarius. As the moon moves through Sagittarius, the moon will actually make a full moon. I'm going to put the actual time in here. We are now looking at the chart for the Sagittarius full moon on June 5th. Some places in Europe and on through Australia, it'll be June 6th. But in the United States, the full moon occurs midday on June 5th. In fact, in Seattle, where I am, it'll be at 12:12 p.m. In New York City on the East Coast, it'll be at 3:12 p.m. And this full moon is at 15 degrees middle Sagittarius, opposing the sun at middle 15 degrees Gemini. And the most significant thing about this full moon is that it occurs while the sun is squaring Mars, which we already talked about, but we left out the full moon. The other thing is that this is not just a full moon, it's a full moon eclipse, because whenever the full moon or new moon occurs near the nodes, and here the nodes are less than 14 degrees away from the actual full moon, that the nodes, remember, indicate the point at which the Earth's orbit around the sun and the moon's orbit around the earth intersect. And so every month when the moon is new or full, it lines up with the sun and the earth, but it's usually above or below the line, the exact lineup. And so when there's the nodes that are when the nodes are involved, what that means is that the earth casts its shadow on the full moon, making a full moon eclipse. Now, in the United States, this will not be visible because it will be midday and the sun will be up above the horizon. The moon will be beneath the horizon. But if you are someplace where it is nighttime, then there is a chance that you'll be able to see this full moon eclipse. Now, the significant thing about eclipses is that, to me, they're a bit Uranian in how they work. Uranus is the planet of sudden change. It's unexpected. It's a shift of energy, and full moon eclipses typically have to do with something that is the past. Remember, the moon is how we hold our memories. It is the past. This full moon eclipse, because it is square Mars, has the potential of having some nasty or violent energy attached to it. Now, I'm not saying that there will be eruptions of violence. Look, there's violence, everywhere around the planet every day, unfortunately. But there's a lesson here to learn, and we may be able to use this full moon eclipse as part of this whole current wake up that hopefully we as a culture are going through. Remember, the full moon in Sagittarius is about ideas. It's about foreign travel, because foreign travel opens up our mind to new ideas that we just can't. We have to go out of our way of how we see things in our regular patterns. If we go to a culture that's completely different, it basically forces our mind to grow and to open. So the Sagittarius moon in general, the full moon eclipse, has to do with foreign, with international travel, with ideas, with big opinions and big thoughts. And here, there's likely going to be some very heightened discussion, because the sun is in Gemini, which is about language and interaction. There'll definitely or likely be some connection here to trade or major trade announcements that, again, have to do with that information going back and forth. Trade is really information, whether it's in the form of goods or ideas or money. And of course, Venus is involved in this because Venus is conjunct the sun only a few degrees, 3 degrees away from the sun itself. But the Mars here is in Pisces. And so again, it's hard to know which side we are on. It's hard to know who's on what side. It's hard to know where this is all going. I think that there's a lot of words being thrown around. And remember that Mars in Pisces is moving toward a conjunction with Neptune that I mentioned earlier, that's exact on June 13th. So this eclipse in some ways is setting that energy up. I think that it's really important during this eclipse. The energy is rather tense. There's 2 saving graces, or actually really one major saving grace. And that is that Mercury, having moved into Cancer, Mercury is forming a sextile with Uranus, which is giving us the ability to use our intellect. Remember, Gemini is ruled by Mercury, or is associated with Mercury. Mercury, now having moved into Cancer, is more sensitive. It's more about our feelings rather than just logic. And so here, as Mercury forms a sextile with Uranus in Taurus, the breakthrough maybe comes from an emotional change or some understanding that allows us to move directly off of mid-center or off of an extreme, which is probably more likely. The one last thing I want to say about this eclipse before we move on is the fact that Remember, we talked earlier that the month opened with the sun making that square and a half to Jupiter. And I said that the sun then would make that same sun would make the same square and a half to Saturn on June 6th. Well, that's 24 hours after this, this full moon. And so what's really happening here is we have the sun coming into this square and a half to Saturn, Mars also forming a half a square to Saturn, same day, that Mars to the sun square. And here we also have the moon forming a half square to Saturn. So starting with the moon, we can see that the moon is half square to Saturn, which is half square to Mars, which is square to the sun. And so this whole thing creates a kind of interlocked, entangled energy that is not easy to manage. This is not going to be an easy full moon. And yet the key is keeping an open mind, and keeping an open mind to the things that you're sure are wrong, because this is Mercury sextile Uranus. The lightning strikes and it's, oh my God, I never saw it that way before. And the more open we can keep our minds, whatever it is that we think is true, the easier it will be to navigate this period of time. There is healing potential here, because Mercury is also forming, it was exact the previous day on the 5th, on the 4th, but Mercury is forming a square with Chiron. And that Mercury's Chiron square actually was exact early in the morning on the 5th. And so this also indicates the potential for healing, but it's also the potential for wounding if we don't express what we need to express in a way that is kind, compassionate, and even diplomatic. Although there are no planets in Libra, we need that Libran awareness to keep things in balance. And I think in some ways, Venus brings that into the equation, because Venus as a ruler of Libra basically gives us the ability to use our charm and our nice way of approaching something, even if it's a difficult issue. All right, let's move on, because over June 7th through the 10th, Venus is now making that same square and a half as she continues to move backward to Jupiter and to Pluto. And this in some ways is going to, normally Venus sweetens the pot, but this is Jupiter and Pluto, and Jupiter is retrograding back toward its second of 3 conjunctions with Pluto. And at the beginning of this talk, I didn't mention, but I should have, that the 3 Jupiter-Pluto conjunctions in 2020, the first was last month, the second one is now, is the end of this month. It's actually on June 29th, the second conjunction. So Venus retrograding through this square and a half to Jupiter and Pluto is significant, because Jupiter and Pluto are drawing closer together as they're both retrograding. Remember, Saturn, Jupiter, and Pluto are all retrograding, but Jupiter is retrograding faster than Pluto. So Jupiter is going to back into Pluto, and that second of 3 Jupiter-Pluto conjunctions will occur on June 29th. The third and final one won't be until November 12th of this year. And then Jupiter will be moving forward quite quickly. And then Jupiter will, as it's moving direct in December, both Jupiter and Saturn move from Capricorn back into, or for Saturn, into or back into Aquarius, and then they line up at the end of December. But the significant thing here is that Venus making this square and a half to Jupiter and Pluto as they're coming back toward a conjunction. Normally Venus is sweet. Normally Venus is really nice. But Venus is ameliorating. Venus as being sweet. If a nasty person comes into your life, and you're sweet to that nasty person, you only encourage them to be nastier. And I'm not saying that Jupiter and Pluto is only nasty, but Jupiter is expansive and Pluto is the underworld. And we certainly saw a dramatic rise in the epidemic or the pandemic, and the fear, which, as many of you know who are following me, I think that, you know, as difficult and problematic and even horrific for many people this virus appears to be, that the real pandemic is the pandemic of fear. And so Jupiter going over Pluto is bringing that up in waves. And so we saw some of that in the first the first time that this happened, and now as it's happening again with Venus making that dynamic aspect, while there's a square to Mars, I think we're going to see some tempers blowing up around what's coming up and how to deal with it. And I don't really think you need to be much of an astrologer to make that assessment, but astrologically, this is where we are, and this is where this energy is going to. By June 11th, the sun now has moved forward, and the sun, which was making a square to Mars back around the full moon, by the 11th, the sun actually forms a square with Neptune. And the sun and Mars are kind of moving at similar speeds right now. The sun's moving a little quicker, but notice here that the sun on June 11th, the sun has just moved over the square. We could back this up 12 hours. There we go. So here the sun is square to Neptune, but it's really not gotten out of its square to Mars. And Mars is coming into that conjunction with Neptune, which is exact on the 13th. My favorite description of Mars and Neptune together is by Grant Louis in the Astrology for the Millions. He wrote that that Neptune Mars together is like the shapeshifter. And you see, because Mars is physical and Neptune is imagination. And there are some people who have Mars-Neptune conjunctions in their charts, or Mars-Neptune aspects even, that have the ability to conjure their physicality by their emotional and or intellectual state. You know, it's an old witchy thing of glamour. You know, to glamorize was actually to be a small, diminutive, 5-foot, you know, woman, and by conjuring up power, appear to be 6 feet, 10 feet tall and amazingly powerful. And that Mars Neptune can do that, but it works both ways. Because if we're unsure of ourselves, we get physically very small, and yet we can also grow to great proportions. Here with the sun squaring this energy, it doesn't make it easy to manage. It's almost like that confusion of Neptune comes through, and it's hard to get traction. It's hard to know where we're going. It's, you know, it's kind of that continuing dance from the sun, Venus squaring Mars back around the full moon, all the way through now, as the sun is moving into the square to Neptune, but it's still not very far. It's only 1.5 degrees, less than 1.5 degrees away from being exactly square Mars. And so this is a pretty tricky thing to follow. Now, again, we have a little bit of an amelioration, a saving grace, a remedy, if you will, and that is that Venus at 9 degrees of Gemini is forming a sextile with Chiron at 9 degrees of Aries. And this is showing us again that that through kindness, through pleasant activity, we can actually create healing, and maybe healing is the most important thing that we can do at this time on the planet. Anyhow, that takes us up through June 11th, 12th, 13th. Let's get to the 13th, and there we can see the Mars and Neptune at 20 degrees of Pisces, and there Mars is even closer. The moon comes right through that point on June 13th. I imagine that that June 12th and 13th will be rather confusing. All this whole time period is confusing, but I think that here we will come up to a point where there'll be more misinformation coming from every which way. We won't know what's going on, and yet as the moon moves into Aries on the following day, the moon moves into Aries on June 14th. I think we actually gain some clarity. On June 14th, we also have the sun making a half square to Uranus, and that is some sharp breakthrough energy that occurs on the 14th. And yet the sun is also making a quincunx. That quincunx is to Pluto. Now remember, all the planets moving through aspects to Pluto hit Pluto, then Jupiter, then Saturn. So that sun quincunx to Pluto is on the 14th. And the sun quincunxes to Jupiter, should be right there, is on the 16th, and the quincunx to Saturn is on the 21st. Now, the 21st is another key date. We'll get there in a minute. But all these quincunxes are incredibly important because they all show the disconnect between Gemini, what we know or what we think we know, the information that's flowing through, the communication that's going on, what we're learning as we're interacting with others, and these deeper undercurrents, Pluto, and the optimism of where we're going to take this energy and what we can do with it, and then the reality of what we need to, or what we will run into as we try to take the big ideas. And so the sun running through this course of quincunxes occurs again June 14, June 16, and then hits the Saturn quincunx on June 21st. But in between that, we have another event that's incredibly significant. A few, we'll get to that in just a minute too. That's June 13th, 14th, 16th, and on the 17th, we have Mercury, which has been slowing down. Mercury actually turns retrograde on the 17th. There it is stationing, and there it is actually retrograding. And this Mercury retrograde in Cancer, sluggish communication, things that are not being said, communication that when we feel emotionally safe can be open and flowing. But that retrograde Mercury is kind of adds to the retrograde Venus, even though she's just about ready to turn direction. And on top of that, we still have the Saturn, Jupiter, and Pluto retrograde. Incidentally, Neptune is stationary. It turns retrograde on the 22nd, just a couple of days before Venus goes direct. So again, we're in this kind of tidal backwash. We can't even tell which way the tide's flowing now. I think that, again, whether we're talking presidential politics or whether we're talking things at work or whether we're talking our own personal economics, I think that I think that to believe that you can figure things out and make a plan is foolhardy, because right now you can't even tell whether the tide is coming in or whether the tide is going out. The waters are swirling around in all different directions. And that's okay. There's nothing wrong with that if we're aware of that's what's going on, so that we don't actually jump into a tidal flow thinking it's going to carry us one way, when in fact, all of a sudden it shifts and carries us somewhere else. So this is the middle of the month. We also have on the 18th, Mars making a half square. We can back this up a day. We have Mars making a half square to Uranus. And this is a bit electric, a bit sudden. In fact, on the 18th, Mars not only makes a half square to Uranus, but it also makes a sextile to Pluto. And interestingly enough, what's going to happen with that Mars is Mars will go through that same dance of first going deep down dark, making a sextile to Pluto, then being hopeful, making the sextile to Jupiter, and then kind of hitting the wall and dealing with the reality and figuring out what it needs to do. So Mars makes the sextile to Jupiter on the 18th, while it's also making the half square to Uranus, which makes it unpredictable and kind of sudden change. Then on the 20th, Mars makes the sextile to Jupiter. And then on the 28th, Mars makes the sextile to Saturn. Now, actually, Mars-Saturn stuff is often difficult because Mars is hot and fast and Saturn is stop. and and yet when Mars and Saturn are in sextile, this is a rare opportunity for us to be highly organized and make a lot of progress because Saturn gives structure to the direction of Mars. And so here I'm thinking that on the 27th, Mars moves into Aries, and as it does, it picks up on that sextile to Saturn. And I'm thinking that that's going to be a very powerful forward-moving period of time, especially because on the 24th, Venus also turns direct. We'll get there in just a second. So let's move this forward because we have one other critical thing here, and maybe one of the most important things that's going to happen all year. And that is we have a total eclipse. It's actually an annular eclipse of the sun. And that eclipse occurs at 11:41 p.m. on June 20th, and the sun moves into Cancer just a handful of hours earlier, actually at 2:43 p.m. And so we have an eclipse of the sun on the summer solstice, and that's the summer solstice in the northern hemisphere. It's the winter solstice for our friends in South Africa and down under. So this eclipse at 11:41 p.m. Pacific time, which actually is going to be on June 21st in New York, because that 11:41 p.m. Pacific time is 2:41 a.m. the following day on June 21st on the East Coast. So let's get the chart for the total eclipse of the sun. So here we are looking at the eclipse of the sun, and it's a variation on a total eclipse. It's technically a total eclipse, but sometimes when the moon is farther away from the Earth, it's kind of like the opposite of a supermoon. A supermoon is a full moon when the moon is at perigee, closest to the Earth. When the full moon is at apogee, meaning that the moon is farther away from the Earth than it usually is, the moon is slightly smaller in the sky. So this is a total eclipse, but it's an annular eclipse, meaning that when the total eclipse occurs and the moon is in front of the sun, it doesn't cover the entire sun. It's more than just the corona and the sky being dark. There's actually a ring around the sun. The light is very weird. I had the privilege of experiencing the last solar eclipse on Boxing Day, was on December 26th, 2019, was total in Singapore. And I had the privilege of seeing that eclipse and photographing it. And it was very interesting because it was a total eclipse and yet it never got completely dark. So this eclipse is that same type of eclipse. But again, total eclipses or solar eclipses are kind of like, the old saying is the king must die. Now, it doesn't mean that everyone who is king or ruling a country falls from power, but it does denote a larger shift of power. And we're in this tidal swirl that is just beyond, I mean, you guys must get bored of me and other astrologers saying this, that this time period is one of the most astrologically extraordinary time periods that humanity has ever seen. I mean, we had this once every 35 year or so Saturn-Pluto conjunction back in January. We have the Saturn-Jupiter conjunction coming up in December, and we'll talk more about that as the year unfolds. But that conjunction, although it's a 20-year conjunction, once every several hundred years, it actually changes elements. And this is a conjunction that's part of what they call the grand mutation cycle, which is another level of powerful change. And now into that, we have this retrograde period, which is very rare, the amount of retrogrades we actually have all at once. And on top of that, we have this total eclipse of the sun on the solstice. While Mercury has just turned retrograde, Venus is just ending her retrograde period. And it's just a very dynamic period of time here. Now, the key aspect, the main aspect that this total eclipse or annular eclipse of the sun is making is actually a quincunx to Saturn. It's a partile, meaning that they're at the same degree, partile quincunx to Saturn, from 0 degrees of Cancer to 0 degrees of Aquarius. Saturn moving backward now, retrograding, and it will retrograde back into Capricorn. But before it does that, there's this total eclipse or annular eclipse that basically shifts all the energy. Everything's up for grabs. And remember, with eclipses, they're strange, they're odd in the way they warp time. But eclipses can have impact for months, for 6 months prior to and after the eclipse itself. Eclipses set up longer cycles, if you will. And it's important that this eclipse is quincunx, not only where Saturn is now retrograding, but it's quincunx the spot where Jupiter and Saturn will conjunct in December once they've both moved direct into Aquarius. And so this quincunx is this irritation that won't go away. Look, there is no solution that's quick and easy to what's going on now, no matter what side of any issue, any political spectrum, any spectrum of any sort. It doesn't matter. Whatever the solution is going to create more problems also. These are very complex times. And I think that this total eclipse in a way highlights that, because it accents that point where Saturn is. Remember, Saturn is the ultimate structure, and this is the larger transition that we're going through when Jupiter and Saturn conjoin at the same degree in December. Again, thankfully, we do have a saving grace, and the saving grace on this eclipse is the fact that Mars is forming a sextile to Jupiter. Now, remember, I said that when Mars forms a sextile to Saturn, which will happen on June 28th, there's a tremendous amount of organization and capability of doing hard work and working with complex tasks. But when Mars is sextiling Jupiter, this is good news. Again, the bad news is that the news can seem too good. I know that sounded funny, but it's the way it works. When Jupiter is energized by Mars, our optimism can go off the map. Our hope, our expansive, that we can do anything, everything is working. Wow, look at all this. There's all this upward and outward energy, and it's exuberant, and it can be really, really useful and really, really profound. However, it doesn't last. And as we move this on from June 20th, we move this on June 22nd, Neptune turns stationary, and then it goes retrograde. Now remember, the outer planet retrogrades go retrograde for 5 months at a time. I don't have the exact date in front of me. Oh, wait, I do. Neptune turns retrograde on June 22nd and turns direct the end of November. And, this is that larger outer planet swirl, because Pluto, which turned retrograde back the end of April, turns direct in October. Saturn, which turned retrograde mid-May, turns direct the end of September. And Jupiter, like Saturn, also mid-May and the middle of September. So Neptune moving so slowly anyhow just adds another layer of subtle, we ain't going anywhere yet kind of energy to this. That's on the 22nd. And by the 24th, now Venus, which has been retrograde, it actually, there it is right there, is stationary, and it turns direct right there on the 24th. It begins moving forward. Takes a couple days for it to gain any speed, but there it is. Venus has actually ended her retrograde period on June 24th. And yet there's something else that's just ready to happen. We have Venus now inching forward. It'll take a few days for her to build up any noticeable speed. However, we're going to get another blast. And this is what I mentioned before. I said I would come back to. And that is that Mars, as Venus is turning direct, Mars is at the last degree of Pisces. Mars has already escaped Neptune. So the confusion is maybe becoming a little less, and yet on the 27th, Mars moves, boom, into Aries. And when Mars moves into Aries, that sets into motion a whole new energetic cycle. But Mars is also forming that sextile to Saturn, which brings in something that's very important. It's interesting because I said earlier, normally Mars whizzes through a sign in about 7 weeks. Because of the retrograde, Mars is going to be staying in Aries until early January, actually until the first week of January of 2021. So it's almost like Mars is slowed down by its retrograde, but also as it moves into Aries, it gets that sextile to Saturn, which right out of the starting gate, Saturn says to Mars, you know, I know you're in your home sign. I know you love that gas pedal. I know you love to react instantaneously, even before, you really even know what's going on. And normally that works for you, but I ain't going to let you be like that. And you're going to thank me for it because I'm going to slow that Mars down. I'm going to put that Mars on a sustained or a sustainable slower burn so that Mars, as it moves through Aries, instead of burning itself out, can build momentum even through its retrograde so that it actually can do what it needs to do by re-energizing everything in this rare retrograde time that we are in. So on the 27th, Mars enters Aries, makes the sextile, the exact sextile to Saturn the following day, but it's right away within close orb. So it makes the sextile to Saturn early in the morning on the 28th. And then on the 29th, we have the Jupiter, which has backed into Pluto, which is still backing up, but there's the conjunction that I had mentioned earlier. And this again is another wave of bringing not only hope and optimism up from the underworld, but also whatever's in the underworld. So we need to be careful here because it's very likely that this Jupiter conjunct Pluto is another wave of uncertainty or expansion of either contagion. And again, it's not necessarily the contagion of the virus. It could just as well be the contagion of fear or misinformation that we're dealing with. But as Jupiter and Pluto line up, we expect we can learn more truth or even see another greater wave of political information suppression, which we're already seeing with the bias and the massive lean from Facebook and YouTube in particular of suppressing information pieces that do not agree with the party line. So we may see that come up on another whole level with a great deal of more of intensity. And so that's the Jupiter conjunct Pluto on June 29th. By June 30th, the Sun makes a square with Chiron as retrograde Mercury is going to be backing into that square. Mercury doesn't reach that square until the 1st of July, but it's right there. So Mercury squaring Chiron, the Sun squaring Chiron, and Mercury is also making a sextile, as is the Sun with Uranus. And again, this is another breakthrough. This is the end of June. The sun conjunct Mercury, and they're both sextiling Uranus. And this is new ideas, new thoughts, new possibilities, innovations. Things are coming from, from left field that we don't expect. And I skipped over the sun and Mercury squaring Chiron. But again, here we have the need to be careful about labeling sickness. And I don't just mean COVID-19. I mean any hurts, any wounds, as the sun and Mercury square Chiron. This is a time where words can wound severely. And so we need to pay attention. Again, it's not about suppressing the truth. It's about saying things consciously so that we don't create more hurt and pain with words that are actually meant to heal. And we end the month with the sun making an exact conjunction, or Mercury making an exact conjunction. Again, it's a retrograde conjunction. So Mercury is between the Earth and the sun, which again means there's an alignment of our will. So the sun, our ego, the fuel that gives us purpose, the sun, and Mercury are words. And this is great and it's fantastic, but because Mercury is inside the sun, it's tough to get that energy out into the real world, outside the sun. And in fact, this may be part of the wound that we're dealing with, is the inability for our words to actually reach their target, because that would be the sun and Mercury making their square to Chiron. Now, having said that, I just want to remind us that both Mercury and the sun are making sextiles to Uranus, and this, in fact, can bring innovative thinking that shoots us ahead. So it's a rock and roll month, no question about it. I am happy to talk about the energy in terms that I do. How this is going to play out, I don't have a clue. And no one else does. If anyone says they do and it turns out that way, they just got lucky. I mean, astrology gives you the ability to describe the energy, but it doesn't give you the ability to describe the specifics. One can use intuition and may be right by doing that, but I'm often careful about not jumping to those conclusions, because I'm creating a template for us to move through the month. This is a month of dynamic change with planets turning direct and retrograde, dynamic change with 2 eclipses, dynamic change with the second of 3 Jupiter-Pluto conjunctions, dynamic change coming from every which way. And yet our forward movement is still very much constricted. Our forward movement, in fact, is not even forward. It's like we're caught in tide pools and whirlpools, and we're not making the progress that we think we need to be making. But as we look back on this period of time, we will realize that the eddies and whirlpools in which we've been trapped are actually giving us exactly what we need. It's important in times of great change to maintain perspective. Perspective is the key. Perspective is the gift that astrology gives to us, because when we have perspective on what's going on, it enables us to navigate the seas of change with greater clarity. We may not know where the energies are going now. We may not know how we're going to come out of the situation that we're in. We may not know our economic or personal or global or political or climatological futures. And yet we do know that this retrograde period is giving us an opportunity to reconsider what was simply a blind motion forward based upon continuing something from the past. And because that we've had this stop action that's been going on, even as we begin to open society, open economics again, however that unfolds, country to country, state to state, the fact of the matter is that if we learn our lessons, if we do the work that astrology is suggesting that we could do now, if we do that, then we will come out of this wiser than we went into it. And in fact, we will be able to alter the very direction of the ship of state, of the direction of humanity itself, by simply creating the necessary drags, the necessary currents that pull the ship around one way or another to get it off of its previously obvious collision course. So thank you. Thank you for your indulgence. Thank you all for your support. Please share this freely. Don't forget to go sign up for the free dailies on Instagram if you so desire. And I will see you mid-month. And thanks again. Remember, even in times, maybe especially in times of great stress, it becomes more and more and more important for us to think bigger, more cosmically, but acting in our immediate environment as locally as possible. I'm Rick Levine.